From the moment Elena Marquez stepped into the emergency department, the rhythm of the room seemed to test her, as if the hospital itself were a living thing measuring her worth. Monitors chimed in uneven harmony, stretchers rattled over tile floors, and the scent of antiseptic mingled with burnt coffee from the nurse's station. She arrived without fanfare, a single duffel bag slung over her shoulder, dark hair tied neatly back, expression composed but distant. The charge nurse introduced her quickly, barely glancing up from a tablet, and within minutes Elena was absorbed into the current of organized chaos that defined the ER. What stood out was not what she did, but what she didn't do. She didn't chatter nervously like most new hires. She didn't overshare personal details in an attempt to bond. She didn't laugh at jokes that felt forced or cruel. She listened carefully to instructions, nodding once, committing everything to memory. Her silence unsettled people. In a place where stress demanded noise as release, her quiet composure felt almost unnatural. During her first trauma intake, a construction worker arrived with a crushed forearm, bone visible beneath torn flesh. While another nurse winced and muttered under her breath, Elena's hands moved with precise calm. She assessed circulation, applied a tourniquet with exact tension, and met the patient's panicked eyes with a steady gaze that anchored him. "Stay with me," she said softly, her voice low but unwavering. The bleeding slowed. The patient's breathing followed her cadence. A resident stared at her technique, noticing the speed, the confidence, the absence of hesitation. "You've done a lot of trauma?" he asked afterward, curiosity edging into suspicion. Elena rinsed blood from her gloves and replied simply, "Enough." In the break room later, the other nurses gathered, whispering over vending machine snacks. "She acts like she's above us," one said. "Or like she's hiding something," another added with a smirk. They speculated wildly: runaway bride, failed surgeon, maybe even witness protection. The stories grew more elaborate with each retelling, laughter cushioning their insecurity. Elena sat at the far end of the table, sipping water, gaze lowered but ears attentive. Their words brushed against her like distant static, incapable of penetrating the discipline she carried within. When a child was rushed in after nearly drowning, it was Elena who anticipated respiratory collapse before the monitors confirmed it. She adjusted oxygen flow, prepared suction, and directed a younger nurse with quiet authority that brooked no argument. The attending physician later reviewed the chart and raised an eyebrow at the efficiency documented there. "Textbook response," he murmured. "Better than textbook." Yet praise slid off her like rain. She nodded once and returned to stocking supplies, reorganizing the crash cart with a system unfamiliar to the staff. Items positioned not by hospital protocol but by split-second accessibility. A senior nurse rolled her eyes. "We don't need military precision here," she joked, drawing a ripple of laughter. Elena paused for the briefest second, fingers resting on a defibrillator pad, memories flickering behind her steady expression. Dust-choked air, shouted coordinates, the metallic scent of blood under a foreign sun, but she said nothing. Instead, she finished aligning the equipment and stepped back, ensuring every tool could be reached without looking. Later that night, as the ER briefly quieted, she stood by the ambulance bay doors watching rain streak down the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, calm, unreadable, carrying histories no one in that building could imagine. She remembered nights far louder than this, when silence meant danger and hesitation meant death. Compared to that, the ER's chaos felt almost gentle. When an intoxicated patient lashed out, swinging wildly at staff, Elena intercepted his wrist with controlled force, pivoting just enough to unbalance him without harm. The motion was fluid, instinctive. Security arrived seconds later, surprised to find the situation already contained. "Self-defense classes?" one guard asked, half impressed. She offered a faint smile. "Something like that." By the end of her first week, the narrative among the staff had solidified. The quiet nurse was strange, overly serious, probably fragile beneath the surface. They mistook restraint for weakness, discipline for detachment. None of them noticed how she scanned entry points whenever a loud noise echoed. None of them recognized the way her posture subtly shifted during high-stress moments, grounding herself before acting. And none of them understood that the silence they mocked was not emptiness but control, the kind forged in places where fear had to be mastered or it would consume you. As her shift ended, she changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, revealing faint scars tracing along her shoulder and ribs, pale lines that told stories of survival. She dressed carefully, movements economical, then slipped a small, worn object from her bag, a navy trident attached to a chain. For a moment she held it in her palm, thumb brushing the metal edges as if confirming it was still real. Her eyes closed briefly, centering herself, before she tucked it back away beneath her shirt. Tomorrow, she would return to the hospital and endure more whispers, more underestimation, more laughter disguised as camaraderie. She would accept it all without protest, because she had learned long ago that true strength does not argue for recognition. It waits. By her third week, Elena had become both a fixture and a mystery in the emergency department, moving through the corridors with the same contained energy that made people instinctively step aside without knowing why. The teasing hadn't stopped. If anything, it had evolved into something sharper, less playful and more probing. They challenged her in subtle ways, questioning her decisions in front of patients, second-guessing her supply arrangements, rolling their eyes when she double-checked oxygen levels or repositioned stretchers to maintain clear exit paths. "You planning for an invasion?" One nurse joked loudly as Elena adjusted the angle of a trauma bed to ensure unobstructed access from both sides. A few laughed, glancing at her for a reaction. She gave none. Instead, she calmly secured the bed brakes and verified the suction unit was functioning. What they interpreted as paranoia was, to her, muscle memory. She had learned long ago that environments turn hostile without warning, that preparation is the thin line between chaos and survival. That lesson had been written into her bones under desert suns and foreign skies, though no one here knew that version of her. The hospital's unpredictability felt almost familiar, except here, the threats wore civilian clothes and arrived in ambulances instead of armored vehicles. The real fracture came on a humid Friday night when the city erupted after a championship game spilled into violence. Sirens wailed continuously, each arrival more critical than the last. A stabbing victim with a punctured lung. A teenager trampled in a riot. A police officer unconscious from blunt force trauma. The ER flooded beyond capacity, stretchers lining hallways, voices rising in overlapping commands. For a moment, the staff's practiced confidence cracked under the sheer volume of need. Orders collided. Equipment disappeared into the wrong rooms. A young nurse froze beside a patient who began convulsing, eyes wide with panic. In that instant, something in Elena shifted, not into aggression, but into unmistakable command. "Clear space. Move him to Bay 3, she directed, her voice slicing cleanly through the noise without needing to shout. People obeyed before realizing they had been instructed. She dropped to the seizing patient's side, stabilizing his airway with swift precision, calling for medication by exact dosage without glancing at a chart. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, her awareness expansive enough to track 3 other patients simultaneously. When the stabbing victim's blood pressure plummeted, she anticipated the crash seconds before the monitor alarm sounded. "We're losing him. Prep for transfusion now," she said, already applying pressure and adjusting the 4-line. A resident hesitated, uncertainty flickering across his face, but the authority in her tone erased doubt. Later, he would admit he didn't know why he trusted her more than the attending physician in that moment, only that he did. In the thick of it, a distraught relative attempted to force his way into a restricted area, shoving past staff in desperation. Before security could respond, Elena intercepted him with controlled, measured force, guiding him back without escalation. Her posture was protective, not threatening, her gaze unwavering yet compassionate. "You'll see him," she assured the man firmly. "But you need to let us work." Something in her composure diffused the volatility, as if she had navigated far more dangerous confrontations and found this one almost gentle by comparison. Hours later, when the surge finally subsided, the ER looked like a battlefield triage. wrappers and gauze scattered, exhaustion etched into every face. The attending physician approached her quietly. "Where did you learn to function like that?" he asked, no humor left in his voice. She met his eyes, weighing how much truth the moment could bear. "Overseas," she replied. It was the closest she had come to an admission. Word began to travel in murmurs rather than jokes. Someone claimed to have searched her name in a veterans database. Another mentioned seeing faint scars along her shoulder when her scrub collar shifted. The laughter diminished, replaced by curiosity edged with discomfort. They replayed the night's events in their minds, recalling how instinctively they had followed her lead. One nurse who had mocked her most openly now avoided eye contact, unsettled by the realization that she had misjudged strength for fragility. Yet Elena behaved as if nothing had changed. She restocked 4 kits, rewrote supply labels in her meticulous shorthand, and documented each case with precise clarity. If she felt their stares lingering longer than before, she didn't show it. Inside, however, the old vigilance had awakened more fully. The chaos had tasted too familiar, the surge of adrenaline, the narrowing of focus, the distant hum of memory that accompanied life and death decisions. That night, alone in her apartment, she sat at the edge of her bed, lights off, city noise drifting faintly through the window. She opened the small wooden box she kept hidden and traced the outline of the Navy insignia resting inside. Faces surfaced in her mind, voices of teammates carried on desert wind, promises made and losses endured. She had chosen this hospital deliberately, seeking anonymity, seeking a way to serve without reliving the intensity of combat. But the past does not dissolve simply because one changes uniforms. It waits beneath the surface, patient and enduring. The next morning, as she walked back into the ER, conversations hushed briefly before resuming in softer tones. Respect had begun to replace ridicule, though no one had yet spoken the questions forming in their thoughts. Elena moved to her station, checked her equipment with habitual precision, and prepared for whatever would come through those sliding doors. She did not need acknowledgement or apology. She had long ago learned that competence speaks louder than reputation. And somewhere deep within her steady heartbeat was the unshakable knowledge that when the next true test arrived, she would be ready, whether they understood her or not. The morning the helicopter came began with an uneasy stillness, the kind that presses against your skin before a storm breaks. The sky over the hospital was a dull sheet of gray, clouds hanging low enough to blur the edges of the city skyline. And inside the emergency department, the night shift was dragging toward dawn with the brittle fatigue that follows controlled chaos. Elena stood at the nurse's station reviewing a chart, her posture relaxed but alert, senses tuned as always to the undercurrents of the room. The uneven beeping of a monitor in Bay 4, the strained whisper of a resident arguing quietly over lab results, the faint metallic rattle of a supply cart wheel that needed tightening. She noticed everything. The others had stopped openly mocking her by now, but the distance remained, an invisible line drawn by pride and uncertainty. A few offered polite nods. One even attempted small talk about weekend plans. Elena answered courteously, though her replies were brief. She had grown accustomed to existing on the periphery, contributing without belonging. Then the sound came, deep, rhythmic, unmistakable. At first it was a vibration more than a noise, a tremor in the glass panes and ceiling fixtures. Conversations faltered, heads tilted. The chop of rotor blades intensified, slicing through the morning quiet with commanding urgency. "Is that for us?" someone asked, half joking, half alarmed. The hospital did receive airlifts occasionally, but this was different. The vibration was heavier, closer, deliberate. Within seconds, the overhead intercom crackled with confusion from administration about an unscheduled military landing on the rooftop helipad. Staff drifted toward the ambulance bay doors, curiosity overpowering protocol. Through the glass, the helicopter descended in a controlled hover, Navy insignia stark against its dark hull, wind whipping debris into spirals across the pavement. The sheer presence of it altered the atmosphere, injecting a charge of authority no one could ignore. Security scrambled. 2 uniformed Navy officers emerged once the rotors slowed, their movements efficient, expressions set with urgency that did not invite delay. They entered the ER with boots echoing against tile, scanning faces until one of them called out clearly, "Chief Petty Officer Elena Marquez." The name hung suspended in the air, heavier than the rotor noise had been. Conversations died completely. Every gaze shifted toward the quiet nurse standing beside the medication cart. For a heartbeat, she did not move, as if allowing the two halves of her life to meet in that single suspended second. Then her shoulders squared, not dramatically, but with unmistakable recognition, and she stepped forward. "I'm here," she said, voice steady, devoid of surprise. A flicker of relief crossed the senior officer's face. "Ma'am, we have a critical extraction situation offshore. Multiple injured personnel. We were informed our most experienced combat medic is currently assigned to this facility." The words detonated silently through the room. Combat medic. Chief Petty Officer. The fragments of rumor suddenly aligned into undeniable truth. The nurse who had once laughed about military precision felt her stomach drop as memory replayed every sarcastic remark. Elena listened without interruption, absorbing details at a speed honed by years of field briefings. Offshore platform, structural collapse, limited stabilization on site, air evacuation required. She asked concise questions: number of casualties, types of injuries, estimated blood loss, environmental hazards. The officers responded with clipped efficiency, recognizing in her tone the familiarity of someone who had stood in far worse circumstances. Around them, the ER staff watched as the quiet colleague they thought they knew transformed not into someone different, but into someone fully revealed. There was no theatrics in her shift of demeanor, only clarity, purpose, and a gravity that commanded respect without demanding it. She removed her hospital ID badge and placed it gently on the counter, the plastic tap echoing louder than expected in the silence. Beneath her scrub collar, the faint edge of a trident tattoo became visible as she adjusted her neckline, the symbol no longer hidden by coincidence but by choice. The attending physician stepped forward, voice subdued. "You're leaving now?" It wasn't a challenge, just disbelief. Elena met his eyes. "They need a medic," she replied simply. No embellishment, no explanation. The same instinct that had guided her in the ER now pointed outward, toward a different battlefield. A junior nurse, eyes shining with a mixture of awe and shame, whispered, "Why didn't you tell us?" Elena paused, considering the question. "It wasn't necessary," she said gently. "I'm a nurse here." The statement carried layers: service without spectacle, competence without announcement. As she followed the officers toward the exit, the staff parted instinctively, not out of fear but reverence. Outside, the wind from the idling helicopter tugged at her scrubs, flattening fabric against scars that told stories none of them would fully hear. She climbed aboard with practiced ease, securing her harness while receiving final coordinates through a headset. For a brief moment before the door slid shut, she looked back toward the hospital entrance where her co-workers stood clustered together, faces pale with realization. There was no resentment in her expression, no triumph at being vindicated. Only the quiet steadiness that had always been there, misunderstood but unshaken. Then the helicopter lifted, rising into the gray morning sky, rotors carving the air as it turned toward open water. Inside the ER, silence lingered long after the aircraft became a distant thrum. The staff returned slowly to their stations, but something fundamental had shifted. The supply cart she had reorganized now seemed less excessive and more visionary. The calm authority they once teased replayed in their minds as evidence of experience rather than arrogance. In her absence, they felt it, the space where her quiet strength had anchored the room. And as the day resumed its ordinary rhythm of illness and recovery, one truth settled over them with undeniable clarity. Heroes do not always announce themselves with stories or medals. Sometimes they work beside you in silence, absorbing your doubt without complaint, waiting only for the moment duty calls them back into the sky.